Caleb Merritt walked into that auction with $37 in his coat pocket and walked out with a wife he'd paid $1 for, and the mockery of an entire town ringing in his ears. He didn't look back. Neither did she. That was the first thing he noticed about Clara Bennett. She didn't cry, she didn't plead, and she didn't thank him. She just picked up her single bag, set her jaw, and walked beside him like she'd already decided something he hadn't figured out yet. If you're new here, subscribe, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction had been going on for 2 hours by the time Caleb Merritt pushed through the door of the Silver Creek Grain Exchange. He hadn't come for the auction. He'd come because Walt Dreher owed him a signed bill of sale on 3 breeding heifers, and Walt Dreher had a habit of being exactly where Caleb didn't want to deal with a crowd. The room smelled like sawdust and pipe smoke, and too many men standing too close together. Caleb found a spot near the back wall, crossed his arms, and waited. He almost didn't look up when Harlan Yates, the auctioneer, a man whose voice could strip bark off a pine, called out the next lot. "Gentlemen, what we have here is a contract of agreement. One Clara Bennett, age 25, of Salina, Kansas. Skilled in domestic management, cooking, sewing, and general household economy. No living family. No property. No debts. She is, as of this morning, without employment or housing." Caleb looked up. She was standing on the low wooden platform at the front of the room, and she was looking at the floor. Not the way a person looks at the floor when they're ashamed. The way a person looks at the floor when they've decided the room isn't worth their eyes. Her dress was clean, but worn thin at the elbows. Her hair was pinned back in a way that looked like she'd done it fast without a mirror. She was holding her bag in front of her with both hands, and her knuckles were white. Not from fear, Caleb would realize later, but from anger. She was working very hard not to show. Harlan Yates spread his hands wide. "Now, gentlemen, this isn't a sale of a person. This is an arrangement fully legal under the Matrimonial Contract Act. Any man here can enter into a 1-year domestic contract with Miss Bennett with the option to formalize the arrangement thereafter. She brings labor competence and—" He paused and smiled at the crowd. "I'll let you assess the rest yourselves." The room laughed. Clara Bennett did not move. "We'll open bidding at $5, Harlan said. Silence. $5 was a meal at the hotel dining room. A night at the boarding house. Nobody moved. Harlan cleared his throat. $4 then. Gentlemen, this woman can cook, sew, and manage a household. That's worth something." Lyle Connors, who ran the feed store, and whose wife had left him 2 years ago, called out, $2. $2.50, said someone near the window, laughing. $2.50 to Mr. Henderson. Do I hear 3? More laughter. Someone made a joke Caleb didn't catch, but the men around him found it very funny. Clara Bennett's knuckles got whiter. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't know why. He'd come in here for a bill of sale. He didn't need a wife. He had $37 in his coat. A ranch hemorrhaging money, a foreman who looked at him like he was a boy playing dress-up in his dead father's hat, and 6 months of debt sitting on the Silver Creek Ranch's books like a stone on a man's chest. He did not need a wife. $2.50 going once, Harlan said. $2.50 going twice. $1. Caleb didn't realize he'd spoken until the room went quiet. Every head turned. He didn't flinch. He kept his arms crossed and his eyes on the front of the room where Clara Bennett had finally looked up and was now looking directly at him, and her expression was not gratitude. It was evaluation. Harlan Yates blinked. "I'm sorry, $1, sir. The current bid is—" "I heard the current bid," Caleb said. $1. Lyle Connors sputtered. "That's you can't be serious." "I'm rarely not serious," Caleb said. The room exploded, not in outrage and laughter, pure, delighted, humiliating laughter. Men slapped each other on the arm. Someone said, "Merritt bought himself a wife for less than a glass of whiskey." Someone else said, "Wonder what that says about the wife." More laughter. Caleb didn't look at them. I was looking at Clara Bennett, and Clara Bennett was still looking at him, and whatever she was reading in his face, she seemed to reach some kind of decision. "Sold," said Harlan Yates, sounding deeply uncertain. 2 to Caleb Merritt, for $1. They signed the paperwork in Harlan Yates's back office, which smelled like old ledgers and regret. Clara Bennett sat across the table from Caleb and read every line of the contract before she signed it. Every line. Harlan kept clearing his throat. Caleb waited. When she finally set the pen down, she looked at him directly and said, "This says 1 year." "That's right." "And at the end of 1 year, either party may choose not to renew." "That's right. And during that year, I manage the household." "That's what it says." She folded her hands on this table. "What does the household consist of?" Caleb leaned back. "A ranch. 2-story house. 4 working hands, sometimes 6 during driving season. 1 cook who quit last month." "Why did the cook quit?" Nobody had asked him that before. He paused. "Disagreement with the foreman." "What was the disagreement about?" "I didn't ask." Clara looked at him, the way a school teacher looks at a student who's given a wrong answer, but is at least trying. "What's the foreman's name?" "Gideon Parker. He's been with the ranch 12 years. He was my father's man." "And you inherited him." "I inherited everything." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. 1 year. I'll manage the house. I'll cook. I'll keep the books if you want them kept, though I'd want access to the full ledgers, not summaries." Caleb looked at her. "Why?" "Because a household can't be run in isolation from the rest of the operation. If supplies are short, I need to know why. If money is tight, I need to know where it's going." She held his gaze without blinking. "I'm not a decoration, Mr. Merritt. I'm a manager. If you wanted a decoration, you should have paid more." The silence stretched. Caleb said, "Fair enough." He put $1 on the table. She looked at it. She picked it up. "I'll keep this," she said, as a reminder. "Of what?" "That I started from the bottom." She tucked it into her skirt pocket. "I imagine I'll end somewhere quite different." The wagon ride back to Silver Creek Ranch took 40 minutes. They didn't speak for the first 30. Clara sat on the bench beside him and watched the land roll by, the wide brown grassland, the fence lines that needed repair, the cattle in the far field that were fewer than there should have been for a ranch this size in this season. She didn't comment. She was counting. Caleb noticed her noticing. "Something to say?" he asked. "Not yet." "But eventually, probably." She looked at him sideways. "Are you a man who wants to be told things, or a man who wants to discover them for himself?" "Depends on the thing." "Fair enough." She turned back to the land. "How long has the herd been running light?" He said nothing. "The east pasture," she said. "I counted from the road. You've got maybe 60 head where there should be 120 for this acreage. Either you sold recently, or you've been losing them somewhere." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "You counted that fast." "I've been managing operations since I was 17. My father had a dry goods operation in Salina, not cattle, but inventory is inventory." She kept her voice neutral. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking." "Parker handles the cattle." "Parker." "The foreman." "Right." She said nothing else. But that one word, just right, said in exactly that tone, sat between them for the rest of the ride like a stone in a shoe. When they pulled into the yard, 3 of the ranch hands were leaning against the water trough. They straightened when they saw the wagon. Then they saw Clara. Then 2 of them exchanged a look that Caleb caught and that made something in his chest go flat. Pete Dunbar, the youngest hand, actually grinned. "Boss brought back a wife," he said, not quite under his breath. $1 worth, said the one next to him, Amos Finch, 28 years old, and already practiced in being unpleasant. "That's enough," Caleb said. Neither of them looked particularly corrected. Clara climbed down from the wagon herself before Caleb could offer a hand. She landed on both feet, picked up her bag, looked at the 2 men who'd spoken, and said pleasantly, "Is there someone who can show me where the kitchen is, or should I find it myself?" Silence. "I'll take the silence as an invitation to explore," she said, and walked toward the house. Caleb watched her go. Then he looked at Amos Finch. Amos Finch looked at the ground. The kitchen was by any honest measure a disaster. Clara set her bag on the only clear surface, a corner of the long oak table, and surveyed the situation. Pots that hadn't been properly scrubbed. A sack of flour with a mouse hole in the bottom corner. 3 cast iron skillets, 1 cracked. Salt and coffee, and not much else by way of spice. Dried beans that had been sitting long enough that they'd need twice the soak. A side of bacon that was fine. Onions. Potatoes in a crate, some of them soft. She opened the larder door. More of the same. She found a ledger tucked behind a jar of molasses. She opened it. The household accounts. She read 3 pages and put the ledger down and sat very still for a moment. Then she got up, found a clean pot, filled it with water from the kitchen pump, and started to boil beans. Because the men were going to need dinner, and dinner needed to happen before anything else could be addressed. And right now, the most useful thing she could do was feed people. She was pulling onions apart when the door opened and a man walked in without knocking. He was tall. Not as tall as Caleb, but broader, with the kind of build that came from a lifetime of physical work, combined with the authority of someone who'd gotten used to not being challenged. He was probably 45, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes the color of river mud, after a rain, not unkind exactly, but evaluating, already deciding. "You'll be the new Mrs. Merritt," he said. "You'll be Gideon Parker," she said without turning around. A pause. He hadn't expected her to know his name. "That's right. Mr. Parker." She turned then with an onion in her hand and looked at him directly. "Is there something I can do for you, or were you coming in for a different reason?" "Just introducing myself." "That's kind. I'm Clara. I'm managing the house going forward. If you need anything from the kitchen stores, you'll let me know, and I'll see what we have." She turned back to the onions. "I noticed the household ledger's been kept somewhat informally. I'll be taking that over." Another pause, longer this time. "The household ledger," he said slowly, "has always been handled by my office." "I understand." Her voice was perfectly pleasant. "Mr. Merritt's asked me to manage the household. That includes accounts. I'm sure that's a relief, one less thing on your plate." She heard him breathe. "I'll speak to Caleb," he said. "Of course." She started chopping. "Dinner's at 6. There'll be enough for everyone." He left. Clara set the knife down, pressed both hands flat on the table, and let herself breathe for exactly 4 seconds. Then she picked up the knife and kept chopping. Caleb came in around 5. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at and smelled something he hadn't encountered in this house in a long time. Actual food. Not the gray-boiled meat and hardtack the men had been surviving on since the cook left. Something that smelled like onions and salt pork and beans cooked slow with something he couldn't name. "Parker came to see me," he said. "I expected he would." Clara didn't look up from the pot. "He said you told him you were taking over the household accounts." "That's what you hired me to do." "He said you were overstepping." She looked up then. "Is that what you think?" Caleb leaned against the doorframe. He'd been thinking about it for the last hour out in the south field, fixing a section of fence that had been needing fixing for 3 weeks. He'd been thinking about what Parker had said. "She's been here 4 hours, and she's already trying to run things." And Parker had said it with the tone of a man who expects agreement, which was the tone Parker always used with him, and which Caleb had always quietly resented. "I think," Caleb said carefully, "that you moved fast. You hired me to manage a household that's clearly been running badly for some time," she said. "Managing a household includes understanding where the money goes. What would you like me to do? Wait a month before I look at the books. The books I looked at this afternoon suggest you might not have a month." That landed. "What did you see?" he asked, and his voice had changed. "I saw a household account that's been running a significant deficit for 6 months. I saw supply purchases that don't match what's actually in the larder. I saw—" She stopped herself. "Mr. Merritt, how much do you trust your foreman?" The question sat between them like a lit match. "He was my father's man for 12 years, Caleb said. "That wasn't what I asked." The silence was long enough that the pot started to bubble. "I'll look at the books myself," he said finally. "That's your right." She turned back to the stove. "Dinner's at 6. He looked at the books. He sat at his father's desk in the study. His desk. He reminded himself he kept forgetting. It was his desk, and he spread out the household ledgers alongside the ranch operation. Ledgers that Parker kept in the office off the barn, which Clara had not yet asked for, and which Caleb had pulled himself. I wasn't a bookkeeper. He knew that. His father had always said that numbers were for men who couldn't ride, which was the kind of thing his father said that felt wise at the time and hollow in retrospect. But even Caleb, looking at these columns with a working man's basic arithmetic, could see that something was wrong. The supply orders didn't match the inventory. Not by a small margin. By a margin that made his jaw set hard. I was still sitting there when Clara knocked on the open study door. "Dinner's ready," she said. Then she saw his face, and she came 2 steps into the room. "What did you find?" "I'm not sure yet." "What does it look like?" He looked up at her. She was holding a dish towel still a little warm from the kitchen, and she was watching him with an expression that was careful and serious and not triumphant. He'd half expected triumph. There wasn't any. "It looks like money going somewhere it shouldn't," he said. She nodded once. "I thought so." She didn't add "I told you so." She didn't need to. "How did you see it so fast?" he asked. "From the household ledger alone. When I ran my father's store, I learned that you can tell a lot about where money's going by what's not there," she said. The household ledger showed purchases for supplies that aren't in this kitchen. Either someone's been eating an extraordinary amount of salt pork on the quiet, or that inventory is going somewhere else. Caleb closed the ledger. "I need to look at the full ranch books," he said. "Not the summaries Parker gives me. The originals." "Yes," Clara said. "You do." She paused in the doorway. "The men are hungry, Mr. Merritt. Come eat dinner. Whatever you're going to do about this, it'll be clearer on a full stomach." He sat for a moment. "My father hired Parker the year I was 15, he said, not quite to her. He said Parker was the only man on the territory who could make Silver Creek run. Your father might have been right about that, Clara said. The question is, who Parker's been running it for? She left. Caleb sat alone at his father's desk. His desk with that sentence ringing in the air. Dinner was the first time the Silver Creek ranch hands had sat at a table with actual conversation in longer than most of them could clearly remember. Clara served beans, salt pork, fried potatoes, and cornbread. Nothing fancy, but hot and plentiful, which was more than they'd had. She sat at the far end of the table, not at Caleb's right hand, and she didn't try to be charming. She was just present and competent, and she remembered every man's name after being told it once, which Amos Finch noticed, and which he didn't like, because it made it harder to dismiss her. Gideon Parker didn't come to dinner. Nobody said anything about that. Midway through the meal, Pete Dunbar, the youngest, the one who'd made the remark in the yard, said quietly, without fully meaning to say it out loud, "This is the best food this kitchen's put out in 2 years." "Thank you," Clara said. "Who taught you to cook like this?" "My mother. And then myself when she was gone." She said it without self-pity, just as fact, and moved the cornbread in his direction. Pete looked at the cornbread. He looked at her. He said, "Sorry about the earlier, what I said." "It was an accurate observation," Clara said. "He did buy me for $1. That's a fact. Whether it means anything is still to be determined." She glanced down the table toward Caleb. "By both of us." Caleb was looking at her. She met his eyes for exactly a moment, then looked away. That night, she sat alone in the small room off the kitchen that was to be hers, and counted what she had. $1 coin in her pocket. The first dollar Caleb Merritt had ever paid her, and the price she'd been assigned by a room full of men who'd found it funny. A bag with 2 dresses, a winter shawl, needles and thread, a small Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins, and a ledger book she'd bought in Salina the week before she left, thinking she might need to keep records somewhere for someone. Knowledge: she could cook, manage accounts, read contract law well enough to know when she was being cheated, and work longer than most men expected a woman to work. A problem. Gideon Parker had been running this ranch however he chose for 12 years, and she had been here for approximately 6 hours, and she had already made an enemy. A worse problem. Caleb Merritt was not a stupid man, but he was a man who'd been trained to trust loyalty over evidence, and Parker had 12 years of loyalty, and she had 1 day. She opened the ledger book and started to write down everything she'd seen. Not accusations, just numbers. What she'd been told was in the larder versus what was actually there, what the household ledger claimed had been purchased versus what was on the shelves. The dates, the amounts. She wrote for an hour. When she finally closed the book, she sat in the quiet of the ranch house at night, the sound of the hands in the bunkhouse distant, the horses shifting in the barn, and she thought about a woman she'd once known in Salina, a Mrs. Aldridge, who'd come to her father's store every Saturday, and always bought exactly the same things, and always left looking like she was carrying something heavier than groceries. Clara had asked her father once what was wrong with Mrs. Aldridge. Her father had said, she married a man who thought less of her than she was worth. Some people spend their whole lives being underestimated. Clara hadn't understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now, not from the inside, but from the outside, not because anyone here had underestimated her, but because she was watching it happen to something else. To a ranch that had been systematically stripped by someone who'd decided it wasn't worth anything more than what they could take from it. She wasn't going to let that happen. The dollar in her pocket was not a humiliation. It was a starting point. She'd started from less. At 7 in the morning, Caleb found her in the barn. Not in the house where he'd expected her to be making breakfast. In the barn, standing in the aisle between the stalls talking to a man named Dill Greer, who was the oldest hand on the ranch, and who in Caleb's experience did not talk to people he didn't respect. They both looked up when he came in. "There's breakfast in the kitchen," Clara said. "I made it early. I wanted to speak to Dill." Caleb looked at Dill Greer. Dill Greer had the expression of a man who'd just been told something he already knew, but hadn't been asked before. "About what?" Caleb said. "About the cattle count," Clara said. "Dill's been here 9 years. He'd know better than anyone what the herd numbers should be this time of year." Dill looked at Caleb. Something shifted in the older man's face, something careful and complicated and very old. "She's right," Dill said quietly. "The numbers are short, have been short, for a while now." The words fell into the silence of the barn. "How long?" Caleb asked. Dill didn't answer right away. He looked at his hat in his hands. "Maybe 18 months. The number hit Caleb like a flat-handed blow to the chest. 18 months. His father had been dead for 22 months. He stood in the barn in the early morning with that calculation running through his head, and he felt something settle over him that was cold and clear, and had no room in it for anything except understanding what needed to happen next. He looked at Clara. She didn't say anything. She'd done what she set out to do. She'd found Dill Greer, and she'd asked the question, and she'd brought Caleb here. What he did with it was his. "Parker's coming in at 8, Caleb said. "I know," Clara said. "I'm going to ask him for the original ledgers." "I know. He may not give them." "I know that." She looked at him steadily. "If he doesn't give them voluntarily, do you have legal authority to demand them as the ranch owner?" Caleb said yes. "Then you should bring someone with you when you ask," she said. "A witness." She paused. "Not me. Someone Parker respects, or at least can't dismiss." Dill Greer put his hat back on his head. "I'll go," he said gruffly. Caleb looked at him. Dill met his eyes. "Your father was a fair man. Whatever Parker's been doing, it's not what your father would have wanted." He paused. "And that's all I'll say on that subject for now." At 8 o'clock, Caleb Merritt walked into the ranch office with Dill Greer at his shoulder and asked Gideon Parker for the original ranch ledgers, not the summaries, the originals, and asked for the cattle sale records for the past 18 months. Parker looked at Dill Greer. He looked at Caleb. "The books are a ranch management matter," Parker said. His voice was controlled. "I handle ranch management." "And I own the ranch," Caleb said. "The books. I'd need to compile them properly before—" "Now," Caleb said. The word was short and flat and left no room. Parker looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, a decision about how far this was going to go here today, and then he turned and pulled a set of ledgers from the cabinet behind the desk and set them on the surface without a word. He set 3 books down. Clara, who had appeared in the doorway, uninvited, unannounced, and carrying 2 cups of coffee that gave her a reason to be there, looked at the 3 books and said pleasantly, "There should be 4. The cattle purchase and sale ledger is kept separately from the general operation accounts." Parker stared at her. Caleb said nothing. He looked at Parker. After a very long moment, Parker reached back into the cabinet and set a 4th book on the desk. Clara set the coffee down, turned and left. Caleb picked up the 4th book. The first page he turned to showed a cattle sale 47 head to a buyer in the next county dated 8 months ago, at approximately 1/3 of market value. Caleb didn't say anything. He closed the book. He picked up all 4 ledgers and tucked them under his arm. "I'll be going over these," he said. "Don't go anywhere." He walked out. Behind him in the office, Gideon Parker stood alone and very still and began to think about how much he'd underestimated the woman who'd arrived yesterday in a wagon for $1 and what that underestimation was going to cost him. That evening, Clara found Caleb at the kitchen table with all 4 ledgers spread out and a lamp burning low. She put a plate of food beside him without being asked, and he ate it without looking up from the pages. After a long time, he said, "He's been selling cattle, undervalued, to a buyer I've never heard of, for 18 months. "Yes," she said. "I should have caught it." "You weren't looking." "I should have been looking." She sat down across from him. "Your father just died. You inherited a ranch you weren't fully prepared to run, a foreman who'd been making decisions for 12 years, and a set of books you were told you could trust. You weren't looking because you had no reason to think you needed to." "That's an excuse." "It's a circumstance," she said. "What you do now isn't an excuse. What you do now is what matters." He looked at her across the table and the lamp. "Why are you helping me?" he said. "Genuinely. You've been here 36 hours. You could have stayed in the kitchen and done the minimum and waited out your year. Why are you—" He gestured at the ledgers at the whole of the evening. "Why are you doing this?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't have an answer, because she was deciding how much of the true answer to give. "My father worked for 30 years to build something," she finally said. "A small operation, not impressive by anyone's measure but his. When he died, there was debt we hadn't known about money. He'd borrowed at bad terms from a man who turned out to have no intention of being paid back in money." She looked at her hands. "We lost everything in 4 months. Not because my father was foolish, because he trusted the wrong person and didn't know it until too late." She looked up. "I won't watch that happen again," she said. "Not if I can see it happening and do something about it. That's why." Caleb held her gaze. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For the way I did this, the auction, the $1. He said it straight without flinching from it. "It was a practical solution to 2 problems, and I didn't think much about what it would be like to be the other problem." She looked at him for a long moment. "It was a practical solution," she agreed. "I accepted it with open eyes." She pushed back from the table. "We both get a year to figure out if we made a mistake. Let's not waste it." She went to bed. He sat at the table with the ledgers and the lamp until past midnight, and for the first time since he'd inherited Silver Creek Ranch, he felt like he was actually looking at what he owned and beginning slowly to understand how to fight for it. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat at his father's desk until the lamp oil ran low, going through all 4 ledgers, line by line, and the more he read, the colder the room felt. Not from the temperature, from the numbers. 18 months of systematic bleeding. Cattle sold at 1/3 of value. Supply purchases that didn't exist in any physical form he could find in the barn or the larder. A pattern so steady and so careful that whoever had designed it had counted on no one ever looking closely enough. Parker had counted on no one looking. He'd been right, until yesterday. Caleb closed the last ledger at 2:30 in the morning and sat in the quiet of the house and thought about his father. James Merritt had built Silver Creek Ranch over 30 years, 1 acre and 1 season at a time, and he'd trusted Gideon Parker completely. Said Parker was the reason the operation ran as smooth as it did, said. Without Parker, the whole thing would have come apart at the seams. And maybe that had been true once. Or maybe Parker had simply been very good at making himself appear indispensable while he helped himself to what wasn't his. Either way, James Merritt was dead and couldn't answer for it, and Caleb was the one sitting in the dark with the evidence of it spread across the desk. He heard the kitchen door open at 5, quiet on its hinges. A lamp lit. The sound of the pump water filling a pot. Clara starting breakfast before the hands were even awake. I didn't go in. He just listened to the sounds of someone else taking the house seriously and felt something in him that he didn't have a name for. Not gratitude exactly, not yet. Something closer to recognition. Like seeing something you hadn't expected to be real turn out to be real. By the time the hands came in for breakfast, Caleb had made a decision. He sat at the table and let Clara serve coffee and cornmeal mush and salt pork, and didn't say anything until the men were settled. Then he said, "I'm going to be going over the ranch books this week. If any of you have information about operations, cattle movements, supply deliveries, anything that struck you as unusual in the past 2 years, I want to hear it. Directly from you, not through anyone else." The table went quiet. Amos Finch stared at his coffee. Pete Dunbar looked at Caleb, then at Clara, then back at his plate. Dill Greer said without looking up, "About time." Nobody argued with that. Nobody offered anything further. Not yet. But the air in the room had changed. Something that had been sealed up was starting to crack around the edges, and everyone at that table could feel it. Clara refilled Dill Greer's coffee without being asked. Parker came to find Caleb at 9 in the south field, where Caleb was walking fence line. He walked up without rushing the way a man walks when he's decided he isn't going to show that he's rattled and said, "We need to talk about last night." "Go ahead," Caleb said, not stopping. "You took my ledgers." "My ledgers? This is my ranch. Those books represent 12 years of operation that I have managed. I know what they represent." Caleb stopped then and looked at him. The cattle sale to Edwin Cross in March. 47 head at $9 a head. Market value was 26. Parker didn't blink. Cross was a cash buyer, fast payment. Sometimes it's worth taking a lower. In August 31, head to the same buyer. $8 a head. Market was 24. Caleb. In November 52 head. $7 a head. Caleb's voice hadn't risen. It stayed flat and even, which was somehow worse. "That's 3 sales, Parker. That's 130 head of Silver Creek cattle sold at a fraction of value to the same buyer over 9 months. And Edwin Cross is your wife's brother." The silence was immediate and total. Parker's jaw worked. I looked it up this morning. County property records. Cross's wife is a Harmon. Your wife was born a Harmon. Caleb held his gaze. "You want to tell me I'm wrong?" Parker said nothing. "I want the rest of it," Caleb said. "All of it. The supply orders that don't exist. The service invoices that were paid to contractors who I cannot find in any business record in this county. I want every dollar accounted for, and I want it on my desk by end of week." "Or what?" Parker said, and his voice had changed. The controlled manager gone something wrong. Ray were underneath. "Or I take what I have to the county sheriff and let him ask the questions," Caleb said. "Your choice." He turned and walked back toward the house. Behind him, Parker stood alone in the south field and said nothing. But his hands had curled into fists at his sides, and his eyes had gone to the house, to the kitchen window, where a shape moved behind the glass. Clara. Moving around the kitchen. Already in less than 2 days, making herself the center of how the house ran. Parker turned away and walked toward the barn, and the decision that had been forming somewhere behind his eyes finished forming. Clara was in the larder that afternoon when Amos Finch came looking for her. She heard him before she saw him. Heavy boots, the deliberate walk of a man who'd prepared what he was going to say. She kept counting jars and waited. "Need to tell you something," he said, stopping in the doorway. "All right." I was quiet for a moment. She turned and looked at him. His face was doing something complicated. The practiced unpleasantness was gone, replaced with something that looked a lot like shame, wearing the disguise of aggression. "Parker told me this morning," Amos said, That if the books came up short, you were the one who was going to take the blame. Said you'd been in the household ledger unsupervised. Said he had witnesses that could say you'd been in the office. Clara set down her pencil. Is that right? He said it to me and Pete both. Said if we were asked, we should say we saw you going through drawers. Did you see me going through drawers? Amos looked at his boots. No. Were you going to say that you had? A long pause. I don't know, he said. Maybe. If he'd pushed. He looked up. He didn't finish the conversation before Dill walked in, and he quit talking. He paused again. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because you're not actually a bad person, Clara said. You're a person who's been working for someone who makes it easy to be worse than you are. He blinked. You should tell Mr. Merritt what Parker said. She continued, turning back to her count. Today, not tomorrow. He needs to know Parker's already trying to build a defense, and he needs to know it from you, not from me. Why not from you? Because coming from me, it's just a wife defending herself. Coming from you, it's a witness. She made a note in her ledger. There's a difference. Amos Finch stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he left. Clara finished her count. Her hand was perfectly steady. Amos told Caleb within the hour. Caleb came into the kitchen 15 minutes after that, and he had the expression of a man who'd just been asked to recalculate something he'd thought was settled. Parker told Amos to lie, he said. About you. Yes. You knew he'd do something like this. I suspected he'd move fast. He struck me as someone who plans ahead. She was stirring a pot and didn't stop. He needs someone to point at. I'm the newest person on this property, and I've been alone with the books. I was the obvious choice. I'm not going to let him. I know. She set the spoon down and turned. But you need more than the ledgers. Anyone can dispute numbers. You need people. Witnesses. People who've seen things over the past 18 months that they haven't said because there was no one to say it to. She looked at him steadily. There's a reason Dill Greer was relieved when you asked questions this morning. He's been carrying something for a long time. Talk to him. Really talk to him. Not about ledgers. About what he's seen with his own eyes. And if it's not enough, then we find something that is. She picked up the spoon again. One step at a time. He started to leave and then stopped. You said we. Did I? Yes. She glanced back at him. Is that a problem? He thought about it. No, he said. I don't think it is. He found Dill Greer in the barn at the end of the afternoon, rubbing down the sorrel mare that had been favoring her left foreleg since June, another maintenance task that had been neglected for months. Caleb took up a brush and started on the other side of the horse without asking, and for a while, neither of them said anything. Dill had been on this ranch longer than Caleb had been alive. He'd seen the whole history of it. He'd watched James Merritt build it from hard ground, and he'd watched Gideon Parker run it after the funeral. Tell me what you've seen, Caleb said finally. Not what you can prove, what you've seen. Dill was quiet long enough that the horse moved between them, impatient. First sale, Dill said. March 2 years ago. Parker told me we were selling a small lot to help with a cash shortfall. Said your father had authorized it before he got bad. I believed him. Was my father bad enough in March to authorize something like that? Dill's hands stopped moving. He was bad enough that he wouldn't have known if Parker told him he'd authorized it. The words landed hard. By the second sale. Dill continued. I knew the price was wrong. Knew Cross by sight recognized him when he came to pick up the herd. Knew Parker's wife's family. Wasn't hard to figure out the connection. He started brushing again, slow and even. I didn't say anything. Why not? Because I didn't know if you'd believe me over him. And because Parker made it clear not in so many words that hands who saw things they shouldn't were hands who found themselves without a job. He glanced up. I have a daughter in Billings. She's got children. I send money when I can. Caleb held that. I'm not going to fire you, Dill. I know that now. He paused. I didn't know it then. You were new. You were young. You came in and Parker was already telling everyone what was what, and you didn't push back hard enough at the start to make a man think pushing back at Parker was safe. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Caleb Merritt in 2 years, and it went in like a blade between the ribs, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. "I'm pushing back now," Caleb said. "Yes." Dill set the brush down and looked at him across the mare's back. "Took the right person walking in your front door." Caleb looked at the horse. "She's something," Dill said, and there was something in his voice that was almost warm. "Came in here this morning asking questions like she'd been on this ranch her whole life. Not telling asking. There's a difference." He picked the brush back up. "Your father would have liked her." Caleb didn't answer. He went back to work on the horse and let that sit. Parker did not deliver the accounting Caleb had demanded. What he did instead was show up at the ranch house that evening, just as the hands were sitting down to supper, and he came in through the front door. Not the kitchen, the front door which nobody used, which was a deliberate statement, and he stood in the hallway and called out for Caleb in a voice that was meant to be heard. Everyone heard it. Caleb came out of the dining room and pulled the hallway door behind him, and Clara, who was serving plates at the table, did not follow. She stood at the table and listened through the closed door, and the men at the table listened with her, and nobody pretended they weren't listening. Parker's voice was low through the door but intense. Caleb's was quieter. Then Parker's voice rose, not quite a shout, but the register of a man who stopped performing patience. "Been on this ranch since before you could sit a horse properly, and I am not going to stand here and be accused." Caleb's voice flat and even. "I'm not accusing you of anything yet. I'm asking you for documentation. Documentation is my professional responsibility, and I don't answer to. You answer to me. That's the only person you answer to, and right now I'm asking." A pause. Then Parker's voice changed. Got quieter. More careful. "You need to think very hard," Parker said, "about what happens to this ranch if I walk. The men trust me. The buyers trust me. The bank. Do you know what Halverson at First County Bank thinks of you? Do you know what he said when your father's estate went to probate? He said this ranch won't survive a year under the boy. Those were his words." A beat. "You want to push me out and try to run this yourself with a woman who's been here 2 days telling you where to look." Silence. Long silence. Clara realized she was holding her breath. "Get the documents to me by Friday," Caleb said, "or I go to the sheriff Thursday night." The front door opened, closed. Caleb came back into the dining room. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and every face at the table was carefully pointed at their plates, except Clara, who was looking directly at him. He looked back. Something had shifted in his face. Not defeat. Something that looked like a man who's just been told he doesn't have the option of half measures anymore, and has decided he's all right with that. He sat down. "Pass the potatoes," he said. Pete Dunbar passed the potatoes. That night Clara wrote a letter. She sat at the small table in her room, with the lamp turned low, and wrote to a woman named Margaret Holt, who was a retired schoolteacher in Great Falls, and who was the only person Clara knew in Montana Territory, besides Caleb Merritt. Margaret had been a correspondent of Clara's mother, and they had never met in person, but Clara had been writing to Margaret for 2 years, and Margaret wrote back with the dry, precise intelligence of a woman who had paid close attention to a great many things over a long life. Clara told her what she'd found. Not everything the letter might be read, and she was careful, but enough. She told her about the ledgers. She told her about Edwin Cross and the Harmon family connection. She told her about Parker's behavior that evening. Then she added one line at the bottom. "If there is anyone in Great Falls who handles legal matters and who is known to be honest, I would be grateful for a name." She sealed the letter. She would post it in the morning herself in town, not through anyone at the ranch. She knew she was moving faster than Caleb wanted her to. She knew he was still thinking in terms of internal resolution, dealing with Parker, directly getting the documentation, making Parker accountable through the ranch's own authority. He wasn't wrong to try it. But she'd watched enough of these situations to know that men like Parker didn't just hand over evidence of their own wrongdoing because they were asked twice. They waited for a better angle. They built their defense. They found a way to reframe the narrative until the person making the accusation looked like the problem. She wasn't going to let Caleb walk into that unprepared. She blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, the distant sounds of the bunkhouse, a horse shifting the wind off the mountains, and thought 3 months. That's what this will take. Maybe 4. But it can be done. She'd started from $1. She'd started from less than that before. The next morning, Clara did 2 things that nobody asked her to do, and that changed the shape of everything that came after. The first, she got up before dawn, saddled the quietest horse in the barn, without asking permission, rode into Silver Creek, posted her letter, and was back before breakfast was on the table. Nobody saw her leave. Nobody saw her come back. Dill Greer saw the horse had been exercised and said nothing. The second thing happened mid-morning. There was a woman named Ruth Garrett who ran the boarding house on the main street of Silver Creek and who supplied the ranch with laundry services twice a month. Sheets, work clothes, the heavy linens that the ranch's own washboard couldn't handle efficiently. Ruth Garrett's delivery boy came at 10 with 2 weeks' worth of clean linens, and Clara met him at the door and carried the bundle in herself, and found tucked between 2 folded sheets a handwritten note that was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Gideon Parker. From Edwin Cross. She read it. She read it twice, standing in the hallway with the clean linens in her arms, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in her apron pocket and finished putting away the laundry and went back to the kitchen and stirred her pot and did not say a single word to anyone until Caleb came in for lunch. She waited until the hands had eaten and gone back out, until it was just the 2 of them at the table. Then she put the note on the table between them. He read it. The color left his face. The note was short. It said, "Parker, the arrangement needs to finish before the end of next month. Once Merritt's banknote comes due, and Halverson calls it, the ranch goes to auction. We move then. Cross." Caleb sat with the note in his hand and said nothing. "The banknote," Clara said carefully. "What is it?" "Loan. Taken out 18 months ago." His voice was flat. "Operating expenses. When does it come due?" He looked up at her. 6 weeks, he said. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. "The sale of the cattle," Clara said slowly, working it through. "The undervalued sales. If Parker was splitting the difference with cross-selling at 1/3 of value and keeping the gap in cash, that's a significant amount of money over 18 months. She held his eyes. "And if Parker helped engineer the situation where the bank loan couldn't be met." "Parker was with me when I signed that loan," Caleb said. "He said it was the only way to cover the operation shortfall. He recommended Halverson." Clara closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them. "Mr. Merritt," she said. "Caleb." It was the first time she'd used his given name. "Parker didn't just steal from you. He built the situation where you'd need the loan. He created the shortfall that made the loan necessary, and he directed you to the lender. And now he and Cross are positioned to buy the ranch at auction when the note calls." Caleb set the note down. His hands were absolutely still on the table. The stillness of a man who is either about to lose his temper completely or who has decided it is too important a moment to do that. "How long have they been planning this?" he said. "I don't know." She folded her hands in her lap. "But the first undervalued sale was 2 months after your father died, which means they were waiting." He said it quietly. "They were waiting for him to die. Or they moved faster once he was gone." She paused. "Either way, 6 weeks." He stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood with his back to her, and she let him stand there, because some things needed a moment and there was no point pushing. When he turned back around, his face was resolved. "I need a lawyer," he said. "I may have already taken a step in that direction," she said. He stared at her. "This morning. Early." She held his gaze without flinching. "I wrote to a contact in Great Falls. I asked for a name. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure you'd agree, and I thought the letter needed to go today. You went to town without telling me." "Yes." "Before dawn." "Yes." He held her gaze for a long moment. "You should have told me," he said. "You're right, I should have. I made a decision I thought needed to be made, and I made it." She met his eyes steadily. "I would make it again." But I should have told you. I'm sorry. He looked at her. Really looked the way he hadn't quite allowed himself to yet. What else? He said. What else are you already thinking about that you haven't told me? Quite a lot, she said honestly. I've been making a list. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not the cross note, a different one, her own handwriting close and neat. Would you like to hear it? He sat back down. Yes, he said. She unfolded the paper and started to read. It was a long list. Outside across the yard, in the ranch office off the barn. Gideon Parker was at his desk, and he was also making a list. Different calculations, different names, a different plan for the 6 weeks ahead. He was certain of several things. He was certain Merritt was out of his depth. He was certain the bank would call the note. He was certain that when the dust settled, Silver Creek Ranch would be his held, through Cross's name, run by Parker's hand, which was the way it should have been from the beginning. What he was not certain about, what he could not account for, no matter how many times he ran the calculation, was the woman in the kitchen. She had been on this ranch for 36 hours. She had found the ledger discrepancy, positioned the witness, gotten Amos Finch to turn, intercepted Cross's note, and was already in contact with someone in Great Falls. 36 hours. Parker was a careful man. He had been careful for 18 months, and he had built something very solid. I was beginning to understand that solid things could still be moved if someone pushed in exactly the right place. He picked up his pen. He needed to write to Cross tonight. The timeline he was starting to think might need to move faster. Parker's letter to Cross went out that same night, slipped to the Silver Creek postal rider before dawn, 2 hours before Clara's letter to Margaret Holt had even dried. Neither of them knew about the other's letter until much later. That was the problem with a war fought on two fronts. Sometimes both sides moved at the same time in the dark, and neither could see what the other had already put in motion. The week that followed was the quietest, dangerous week Caleb Merritt had ever lived through. On the surface, nothing changed. Parker came to work. The hands rode out. Clara cooked and managed the house and kept her ledger and said nothing about what she'd found in that folded note. Caleb went through the books every night after supper, cross-referencing, building a picture line by line, and the picture got uglier every time he looked at it. Friday came. Parker did not deliver the documentation Caleb had demanded. Caleb went to the office at noon and said, "You didn't bring the accounting." "I need more time," Parker said without looking up from the desk. "The records are complicated." "They weren't too complicated for you to keep for 12 years. Caleb. Parker leaned back in his chair and looked at him with something that was almost paternal, the look of a man who considers himself the adult in the room. "You're making this into something it isn't. There are cash transactions in ranch operations that don't always have neat paper trails. That's the nature of this business. You'd know that if you'd been running operations longer." "Give me what you have by Monday," Caleb said. "All of it. And if I decide I've had enough of this and walk—" "Then you walk," Caleb said, "and I call the sheriff that afternoon." He turned and left before Parker could read the uncertainty in him, because there was uncertainty even now. The banknote was 6 weeks out. If Parker walked and took whatever knowledge he had with him, and if the sheriff investigation took months, which investigations always did, the note could come due in the middle of everything, and Halverson would call it, and Cross would move, and the whole thing would collapse before Caleb could stop it. He needed the timeline to hold. He needed a lawyer, and he needed Clara's contact in Great Falls to write back before Parker decided patience was no longer his best strategy. The response came on Tuesday, not a letter, but a man. He arrived on the afternoon stage from Great Falls, a compact man in his late 40s named Solomon Farr, who carried a leather case and wore the kind of suit that said, "I am serious," without saying anything else. He asked for Mrs. Merritt at the door of Silver Creek Ranch, and Pete Dunbar came to get Clara with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure what to make of this development. Clara met Farr on the front porch. She shook his hand, looked at his case, and said, "You came yourself." "Margaret Holt said it was urgent enough to warrant the trip," Farr said. She said, "She found Caleb in the south pasture." She said, "A lawyer just arrived from Great Falls. His name is Solomon Farr. He came because I asked Margaret Holt for a name, and she apparently decided a letter wasn't fast enough." She paused. I know I should have told you about the letter. I'm telling you now about the lawyer. Caleb looked at her for a moment that stretched. Is he good? He said. I don't know yet. Margaret says so. That's enough for now. All right, he said. Let's go hear what he says. Solomon Farr had been practicing law in Montana Territory for 19 years, and in that time he had handled 11 land fraud cases, 7 bank disputes, and 1 criminal trial involving cattle theft on a scale that had made the territorial newspapers. He was not easily impressed, and he was not easily alarmed. He was, however, clearly interested. He laid the documents Caleb had gathered across the kitchen table, the ledgers, the cross-note, the county property records showing the family connection, the timeline of undervalued sales. Caleb had reconstructed from the books, and he went through them in silence for 20 minutes while Caleb and Clara sat across from him and let him work. When he looked up, he said, "The note from Cross. How did you come by this?" "It came with a laundry delivery," Clara said. "Tucked between linens. I believe it was intended for Parker and was misdelivered." Farr looked at her. "You kept it?" "I kept it." "Good." He tapped the page. "This combined with the cattle sale records and the family connection establishes a pattern. Not proof in itself, a defense attorney would argue coincidence, but enough to justify a serious investigation." He turned to Caleb. "The banknote. Do you have the original loan documents?" "In my father's papers." "I'll need to see them. The interest terms, the due date, the name of the specific officer at First County Bank who originated the loan." "Halverson. Douglas Halverson." Farr was quiet for a moment. "Douglas Halverson," he repeated. Something in his voice made both of them look at him. "You know him," Clara said. "He came up in a land matter I handled 2 years ago in Cascade County," Farr said carefully. "The matter was resolved before I could fully develop the connection, but his name was adjacent to certain questions I was asking." He looked at Caleb directly. "Mr. Merritt, is it possible that the loan terms are structured in a way that makes it very easy for the bank to call early under specific conditions?" Caleb said, "I don't know. I signed it because Parker said to sign it." "Get me those loan documents tonight," Farr said. Caleb went and got them. The loan documents were 11 pages. Farr read them at the kitchen table while Clara made coffee and Caleb stood by the window with his arms crossed, watching the yard, watching the light from the office off the barn where Parker was still working late. After 15 minutes, Farr set the pages down and picked up his coffee and said, "There's a clause on page 7. Caleb turned from the window. "Standard operating loans have a fixed due date," Farr said. "This loan has a performance clause. If the ranch's cattle inventory drops below a specified threshold at any point in the loan period, the bank has the right to call the note immediately. No warning, no grace period." He looked at Caleb. "What is the specified threshold?" Caleb looked at Clara. Clara said very quietly, "How many head is the threshold?" Farr looked at the document. 150 head minimum. The kitchen went silent. Because in the current state of Silver Creek Ranch, after 18 months of Parker's undervalued sales, after 130 head moved to Edwin Cross at criminal prices, Caleb Merritt did not have 150 head. He had less than 100. "The clause has never been triggered," Farr said, "because until now, no one at the bank has done a formal inventory count." He set his coffee down. "If Halverson sends an auditor to count the herd, which he has the legal right to do at any time, the note comes due in 30 days. "Parker knows the inventory count," Clara said. "Yes," Farr said. "And Parker has been corresponding with Cross about timing." "Yes." "So Parker tells Halverson the count is short. Halverson triggers the clause, the note comes due, Cross buys at auction." She said it steadily, working through each step, the way a person works through arithmetic, when the answer is already clear, and they need to say it out loud to believe it. Parker gets a share of the sale. Halverson gets a commission or a stake. Cross gets Silver Creek Ranch for a fraction of what it's worth. "That would be my read of the situation," Farr said. Caleb had not moved from the window. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled in the way things are controlled when the alternative is not. "My father built this ranch for 30 years. Parker watched him do it. My father called him a partner." A pause. He called him a partner. Nobody said anything to that. What do we do? Caleb said. Caleb. Farr folded his hands on the table. 3 things, and they have to happen in the right order. First, you need to rebuild the herd. Quickly. If the inventory can be brought above the threshold before Halverson triggers the clause has no teeth. In 6 weeks, Caleb said. With what money? That's the second thing. The undervalued sales to Cross represent a provable fraud against your estate. The cattle were yours. The sales were conducted by Parker, acting without proper authority, at prices that represent a deliberate deception of the owner. You have grounds to file for the difference, the gap between what Cross paid and market value for every single transaction. That's a civil claim, but it can also be used to freeze Cross's assets while the investigation proceeds. Will a judge grant that quickly enough? I know a judge in Helena who owes Margaret Holt a significant personal debt. Farr said entirely without emotion. I'll send a telegraph tonight. Clara looked at him. And the third thing, Parker, Farr said. He can't know any of this is happening until it's too late for him to move. Right now, he's in his office across the yard, and he believes he still has the upper hand because he believes you're still operating reactively, asking for documents, threatening the sheriff, moving slowly. If he finds out a lawyer arrived from Great Falls today, he may accelerate the timeline. He may contact Halverson tonight. Then Parker can't know you're here, Clara said. No, Farr said. He can't. She looked at Caleb. Caleb turned from the window. Where did you stay in town? I intended to find a room at the boarding house. You'll stay here, Caleb said. We'll put you in the east room. Parker doesn't go in the house and the hands won't ask questions. He paused. Clara, can you get word to Dill Greer without going past the office? Through the barn, she said. He bunks on the near end. I can go after Parker's light goes out. Good. Farr looked between them. You've done this kind of thing before, he said to Clara. Not a question. No, she said. But my father taught me that when someone is trying to take what's yours, the only thing worse than fighting slow is fighting visible. She stood and began clearing the coffee cups. Tonight Parker thinks he's winning. Let's let him think that one more night. She went to Dill Greer at 10:30 when the office light had been out for 40 minutes and the bunkhouse had gone quiet. She brought 2 cups of coffee because a woman crossing a dark ranch yard at night with coffee in her hands was someone checking on an older worker, and that was a thing people understood. Dill was still awake. He always was late, the particular insomnia of a man who'd been carrying a guilty conscience for too long. He let her in and took the coffee and listened while she talked. She told him what Farr had found in the loan documents. She told him about the performance clause. She told him what was going to happen if Parker moved first. When she finished, Dill was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you need from me? 2 things, she said. Tomorrow, I need you to ride out and count the herd. Every head, every pasture, exact numbers. Don't tell Parker what you're doing. Don't tell anyone except Mr. Merritt. And the second thing. The first undervalued sale, March 2 years ago. You said Parker told you Mr. Merritt's father authorized it. That's right. Was there a document? Anything written? A note? An authorization? Anything with the elder Mr. Merritt's name on it? Dill set his coffee down. Parker had a paper. Showed it to me for about 30 seconds. Said it was authorization from James Merritt. Did you read it? Started to. Parker took it back pretty fast. What did you see? Dill thought. It was short. Had James Merritt's signature at the bottom, or something that looked like his signature. He paused. I've seen James Merritt's signature on 100 ranch documents over the years. The signature on that paper was, it wasn't wrong exactly, but it was too neat. James Merritt had a big looping signature. This one was smaller, tighter. He looked up at her. I told myself I was seeing things, Clara said very carefully. If Parker forged an authorization for that first sale, the fraud starts there, not with the financial discrepancy. It goes from a civil matter to a criminal one. Dill said, I know. Will you say that in front of a lawyer, in front of a judge? He was quiet long enough that she didn't push him. She let the silence do what silence does, let a man sit with the weight of what he'd been carrying, and decide whether he'd rather keep carrying it or put it down. "My daughter's children," he said finally. "If I testify and Parker walks anyway." "Mr. Farr believes he won't walk," she said. "And neither do I. But I won't pretend there's no risk. There's always risk." She held his gaze. "You've been sitting on this for 2 years. Every month it sits, it gets heavier. And Parker uses the time you give him." Dill picked up his coffee and finished it. "I'll do it," he said. "But you better make sure the lawyer's worth something." "He came all the way from Great Falls the same day I asked for him," she said. "I think he's probably worth something." The next morning, Dill rode out to count cattle. Parker watched him go from the office window and asked Caleb over breakfast where Greer was heading. "Fence check," Caleb said. "The east line's been soft since spring." Parker accepted this. He had no reason not to. He had in his assessment everything under control. He'd written to Cross. Cross had written back fast, which was good, saying the timeline could accelerate. Halverson could be contacted within the week. The audit could be scheduled. If the count came in short, the clause triggered, and in 30 days, Silver Creek went to auction. Parker would be out of this house and managing a property. He actually had a stake in the way it should have been 15 years ago, when James Merritt had promised him partnership, and then quietly decided he didn't need to make that promise official. James Merritt, who had built this ranch on Parker's labor and Parker's knowledge and Parker's 12-year commitment, and had rewarded him with a salary and a foreman's title, and the kind of respect you pay a good employee, not a man who'd given you the best years of his working life. Parker did not feel guilty about what he'd built with Cross. He felt if anything like a man collecting something he was owed. He finished his breakfast and went back to the office. Dill came back at 3 in the afternoon. He found Caleb in the barn and said quietly, 91 head. Across all pastures, that's the count. Caleb did the math. 59 short of the threshold. In 6 weeks, he said. What would it cost to buy 59 head at current market? Dill thought. Good stock $12, maybe $14 a head. You're looking at $700-800 minimum. Caleb went still. I didn't have $700. He didn't have $400 in liquid funds, not without touching the operating account. And touching the operating account would show up in the books, and Parker would see it and start asking questions. He went to find Farr. Farr was in the east room, writing in a tight, neat hand that covered both sides of the paper. Caleb sat down across from him and said, We need 59 head to get above the threshold. I don't have the money. Farr set down his pen. He looked at Caleb for a moment. Then he said, Mr. Merritt, the civil claim against Cross for the fraudulent sales. The difference between what he paid and market value across all those transactions. Do you know what that number is? Caleb had done the calculation the night before. Approximately $2,000. That claim can be used as collateral, Farr said. There are lenders in Helena who will advance operating funds against a civil claim of that credibility. I've done it before. It takes 5 days to arrange. He paused. However, Cross and Parker don't know about the claim yet. The moment I file it, they'll know we're moving. The element of surprise disappears. When did you plan to file it? When we had enough to make it impossible for them to respond effectively, Farr said. Ideally at the same moment we move on all 3 fronts simultaneously. File the civil claim, request the criminal investigation, and have the herd above threshold before Halverson can trigger the audit. But getting the herd above threshold requires the money, and the money requires filing the claim which tips Parker off. Yes, Farr said. Then we have a timing problem. We have a timing problem, Farr agreed. They sat with that for a moment. Then Clara appeared in the doorway. She had a dish towel in her hand and flour on her sleeve, and she had clearly been listening from the hallway for the past 2 minutes, which neither of them had the energy to object to. The Haskell brothers, she said. Both men looked at her. I heard Pete Dunbar and Amos talking at breakfast. The Haskell brothers have a spread 15 miles north. They've been trying to sell 60 head for 2 months because their water rights are disputed and they can't run the herd through the summer. She looked at Caleb. Would they take a note signed by you with the ranch as collateral due in 90 days? Caleb said. I don't know the Haskells. Pete Dunbar does, she said. He worked for them before he came here, and Pete Dunbar has been on your side since the cornbread. She held Caleb's eyes. Let me send Pete today. Not to buy, just to ask if they'd be willing to talk. The two men looked at each other. It doesn't tip Parker, Farr said slowly. A hand riding to a neighboring ranch is a normal thing. And if the Haskells agree, Clara said, we can move the herd before Parker has any reason to expect it. Caleb looked at her in the doorway with the dish towel and the flour and the absolutely steady gaze. You've been thinking about this since this morning, he said. I've been thinking about it since Dill told me the count last night, she said. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure the number would be short enough to make the Haskell option necessary. You knew Dill was counting last night. I asked him to count, she said. I'm sorry, I should have told you that too. Caleb looked at her. Not with irritation exactly. With something else, the growing, slightly unsettling recognition that the woman he'd brought home for $1 was operating about 2 moves ahead of everyone else in the room, and had been since the first day, and that this was at the same time the best and most complicated thing that had happened to Silver Creek Ranch in 2 years. Send Pete, he said. Pete Dunbar left for the Haskell spread at noon and was back by 4:30 with the answer, the brothers would talk, they were interested, and they wanted Caleb to come in person. Parker saw Pete ride out and come back and asked nothing. He was composing his own letter to Halverson this time, the first careful nudge toward the audit he needed. That letter went out with the evening postal rider. Clara didn't know about it until the next morning, when Amos Finch, who had completed his turn from uncomfortable to actively committed the way a man sometimes does when he decides what side of something he wants to be on, told her he'd seen Parker hand something to the postal rider at dusk. She told Farr. Farr set down his coffee cup with a careful, precise click that was the most alarm he allowed himself to show, and said, How fast can Caleb get to the Haskells and back? Half a day's ride, she said. He could be there and back by tonight if he leaves now. Then he needs to leave now. She went and got Caleb. She told him in the barn while he was saddling his horse, both of them moving fast and low, and she said, Parker wrote to Halverson last night. We don't know what he said, but if he asked for the audit, the timeline just got shorter. Caleb pulled the cinch tight. I'll close the deal with the Haskells today. Offer them the full note terms. Don't negotiate down we need them more than they need us right now. He swung up. I know, he said. And Caleb. She looked up at him on the horse. You're not your father. He looked down at her. Your father trusted Parker because he thought loyalty was enough. You're not doing that. You saw the problem, you're moving on it, you're fighting for this ranch. That's not the same man. She stepped back. Go. He went. She stood in the yard and watched him ride out, and then she turned and walked back toward the house because there were still things to do, and watching someone ride away was not one of them. She passed the office on the way, and through the window she could see Parker at the desk, head down writing, and she felt the particular cold clarity of knowing that the race was on, and that neither side knew exactly how far ahead or behind the other one was, and that the next 48 hours were going to determine which of them had moved fast enough. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table with her ledger and started calculating exactly what she needed to do next, because there was no margin left now for anything to be left to chance. The dollar coin was in her apron pocket. She touched it once without taking it out, the way you touch something that reminds you who you are. Then she picked up her pen and got back to work. Caleb came back from the Haskell spread at 8:30 that night with a signed note in his coat pocket and 63 head of cattle agreed upon for delivery in 4 days. He came through the kitchen door and put the note on the table, and Clara read it without picking it up, and then she looked at him and said, 63. They had 3 extra they wanted rid of, he said. I took them. The note terms, 90 days 5%, due after the civil claim settles. He poured himself water from the pitcher and drank it. The older Haskell brother Rupert said he'd heard rumors about Parker and Cross for months. Said 2 other ranchers in this county had been approached by Cross about buying distressed properties in the last year. He set the cup down. We're not the only ones. Clara straightened. How many? She said. At least 2 that Rupert knew by name, maybe more. Caleb looked at her steadily. This isn't just about Silver Creek Ranch. She turned and walked to the hallway without a word and knocked on the east room door. Farr opened it, still holding his pen. She said, "Get your coat. You need to hear this." The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table until midnight. What emerged as Caleb laid out what Rupert Haskell had told him was something larger and uglier than any of them had originally calculated. Cross and Parker hadn't built their scheme around Silver Creek Ranch alone. They'd been working the territory, identifying properties with weak ownership transitions, aging owners' debt exposure, operational problems, and positioning themselves to acquire them at distressed prices through a combination of manufactured crisis, friendly bank arrangements, and foremen or managers who could be bought or who were already in Parker's network. Silver Creek was the largest target, but it wasn't the only one. Farr sat very still through all of it, and when Caleb finished, he said, "This isn't a civil matter anymore. This is a criminal conspiracy." "Can you prove it?" Clara asked. "Not tonight," Farr said, "but if the other affected ranchers are willing to come forward." He stopped, looked at Caleb. "Would the Haskells testify?" Rupert said he would, said he'd been waiting for someone to move first. Caleb paused. He also said Parker came to him 6 months ago, offered him a below-market buyout, said the offer came with an implication that refusing it would make things difficult. "Parker threatened him," Clara said. Not in words anyone could put in front of a judge, but Rupert understood the message. Farr stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his hands clasped behind his back. When he turned around, his face had the expression of a man who has just recalculated the scale of what he's dealing with and found it considerably larger than expected, but not fundamentally different in kind. "I need to go to Helena," he said. "Not by telegraph, in person. There's a territorial prosecutor named Aldrich, who I've worked with before. If I can put what we have in front of him, combined with testimony from Dill Greer documentation, from the Haskell brothers and the Cross note, he can open an investigation that moves faster than any civil proceeding and that Parker can't simply paper over." He looked at Caleb. "Can you hold things together here for 2 days while I make the trip?" "Provided Parker doesn't move first," Caleb said. "When are the Haskell cattle arriving?" 4 days. "The herd will be above threshold before Parker can trigger the audit," Farr said. He wrote to Halverson, but an audit takes time to schedule. 4 days is enough barely. He picked up his case. "Don't let Parker leave this property, not until I'm back." Clara said, "How do we keep him here without him knowing we're keeping him here?" Farr looked at her. "That," he said, "is your problem. I have every confidence you'll solve it." He left before dawn. Caleb drove him to the Silver Creek stage himself, and they went by the back road, which added 20 minutes, but didn't pass the office window. Parker came in for breakfast at 7 and said nothing unusual. He ate his food and drank his coffee, and watched Clara move around the kitchen with the expression of a man who has already written off something he considers a nuisance. Clara watched him watching her, and kept her face perfectly neutral. After he left, Pete Dunbar lingered at the table. "Parker's different this week," Pete said low. "He's waiting for something. You can feel it." "I know," Clara said. "What is he waiting for?" "An answer from the bank." She looked at Pete directly. "We need a few more days. Can you keep the hands busy and out of Parker's ear? Dill's already on our side. Amos is. But the 2 new men, Crane and whoever that is with the red beard." "Tobias," Pete said. "Tobias Walsh. He's Parker's man. He came on 3 months ago. Parker hired him directly." He paused. "Crane, I don't know." Clara absorbed this. A plant. Parker had someone in the bunkhouse. "All right," she said. "Keep Tobias Walsh busy and away from the office. I don't care how." She thought for a moment. "The south fence needs a full day's work. Take him there. Take Crane too if you're not sure about him." Pete stood up. "You know, when Caleb brought you here, I thought—" He stopped. "You thought exactly what you said in the yard," she said. $1's worth." He had the grace to look properly ashamed. "Yeah. You've made up for it," she said. "Go ride fence." He went. The problem with keeping Parker contained without letting him know he was being contained was that Parker was not a stupid man, and he'd been reading the landscape of this ranch for 12 years. He noticed patterns. He noticed absences. And by the second day of Farr's absence, he noticed that Caleb was present on the property in a way he normally wasn't, moving around the yard, checking on things, finding reasons to be visible. He came to find Caleb at the water trough at mid-morning and said, "You're not riding out today." "Things to do here," Caleb said. "You haven't left the yard in 2 days." "Neither have you," Caleb said. "Didn't think it was a competition." Parker studied him. "I'm expecting a letter from the bank." "All right. When it comes, I'd like to discuss it with you directly, before anyone else." He said it with the careful emphasis of a man who means the opposite of what he's saying. "Before your wife, before whoever else you're listening to." "Bring it to me when it comes," Caleb said. "I'm not hard to find." Parker turned and walked back toward the office, and Caleb watched him go, and felt the particular cold weight of a man standing on a frozen river in spring, knowing the ice would hold, not knowing for how long. The letter from Halverson arrived the following afternoon. It came with the postal rider at 2 o'clock, and Parker intercepted it at the gate before it reached the house. Caleb saw this from the barn through the open doors and said quietly to Dill Greer beside him, "He's got it." "What do we do?" Dill said. "We wait," Caleb said. 10 minutes, then I go ask him about it." He waited 12. When he walked into the ranch office, Parker was at the desk, and the letter was in his hand, half folded, and his expression had shifted into something Caleb had never seen on his face before. A controlled excitement underneath the surface. The expression of a man who's just been told the thing he's been waiting for is finally in motion. "Letter from the bank," Caleb said. Parker looked up. "Yes." He set it down face down on the desk. "Halverson wants to schedule a routine audit. Inventory count. Nothing unusual, they do it periodically on outstanding loans." "When?" "Next week." Parker's voice was smooth, practiced. "It's routine, Caleb. Don't read anything into it." Caleb held his gaze. "All right," he said. "Let me know the date when it's confirmed." He walked out. He walked directly to the kitchen and stood at the table and said to Clara, who was there and could see it in his face, "Halverson wants the audit next week." Clara put down what she was holding. "The Haskell cattle," she said. 4 days. The audit is next week. It's going to be close." "How close?" He did the calculation. "If the cattle arrive as agreed, we're above threshold by the time the auditor comes. But if anything delays the delivery—" "Nothing will delay it," she said. "Pete will ride out to the Haskells tomorrow and confirm. And Dill will be at the gate the morning of the delivery, not Parker. Parker will want to be there for a cattle delivery." "I'll keep Parker busy," she said. He looked at her. "How?" She picked up what she'd been holding, a piece of paper, her own handwriting. "I've been compiling a full household accounts report. Everything since I arrived. I'm going to give it to Parker tomorrow morning and tell him I need his signature as ranch manager to confirm the accounting is accurate and in order." She looked at Caleb steadily. "He'll spend 2 hours trying to figure out if there's anything in that document that can be used against him. That's 2 hours he's not in the yard." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's dangerous," he said. "If he thinks you're building a case, he already thinks that. I'm just giving him something to look at that takes his attention." She put the paper down. "I'm not afraid of Gideon Parker." "I know you're not," he said. "That's part of what worries me." She looked at him, and something in his voice registered, not the tactical concern, but the one underneath it. The one that was about her specifically. About the fact that Parker had already tried to frame her once and was capable of more than that, and Caleb knew it. "I'll be careful," she said. "Clara." He said it the way he'd only said her name a handful of times directly, without the buffer of practicality around it. "I need you to promise me you won't take any step that puts you in a room alone with Parker. Not until Farr is back." She held his eyes. "All right," she said. "I promise." Farr came back the following evening. He came in through the kitchen door with dust on his coat and the expression of a man who has run hard and landed somewhere solid. He sat down and said, "Aldrich is opening a criminal investigation. He's sending a deputy territorial marshal to Silver Creek in 4 days. The marshal will serve notice on Parker and Cross simultaneously. Parker here at the ranch, Cross at his property in the next county." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. "Simultaneously," Caleb said. "So neither one can warn the other," Clara said. "Correct." Farr set his case on the table. "I also spoke to 2 men Aldrich knows in the banking commission about Halverson. What I found—" He paused, and his voice shifted into the register of a man delivering something heavier than he'd expected. "Halverson has done this before, not with Cross, with a different buyer in Cascade County 3 years ago. 2 ranch families lost properties through the same mechanism, manufactured loan default performance clause triggered, distressed auction." He looked at Caleb. One of those families was a widow. She had 3 children. She lost everything. No one spoke. "Halverson was never charged," Farr said, "because neither family had the resources to mount a proper legal challenge, and there was no one to connect the pattern." He looked between them. "You're the first people who've put the pieces together completely." Clara said, "The widow. What happened to her and her children?" Farr's jaw tightened slightly. "She went to work in a boarding house in Cascade City. The children were split between relatives." A pause. "I have her name and location. If she's willing to testify, her account of the prior scheme makes Halverson's pattern provable, not just probable provable." "Can you reach her?" Clara asked. "I already sent a letter from Helena." He opened his case and pulled out a document. "But in the meantime, I've filed a motion in Helena to delay the audit pending investigation of the loan's originating circumstances. A judge has granted a temporary stay." He slid the document across the table. "The audit is postponed. Parker doesn't know yet." Caleb picked up the document. He read it. He set it down. I didn't say anything for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was rough at the edges, in the way voices get when something long held is beginning to loosen. "My father," he said. "Parker told him the operation needed that loan. My father trusted him. He signed documents right before he died that he may not have fully understood. The loan authorization," Farr said carefully, "bears your father's signature. I have not had it forensically examined. But given what Dill Greer has told us about the cattle sale authorization, the signature he saw, that struck him as not quite right." "You think Parker forged my father's name," Caleb said. "I think it's possible. And if it is, the loan itself may be fraudulent, which means—" "There is no legitimate debt," Clara said quietly. "Not to Halverson, not under those terms." The weight of that settled over the room. Caleb pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at them, the hands of a man who'd been working a ranch for 2 years, thinking he was fighting to manage his inheritance, only to discover he'd been fighting to keep something that was being systematically stolen from under him by someone who'd called his father a friend. "I want Parker off this property," he said. "Not in 4 days when the marshal comes. Now." Farr said, "Caleb, I know." He pulled his hands back. "I know. We move when the marshal comes, not before." He looked at Farr. "But when he comes, I want to be standing in that yard." "You will be," Farr said. The next morning, Clara gave Parker the household accounts report. She brought it to the office herself, which she'd promised Caleb she wouldn't do, but she stood in the doorway and held it out without going in, and Parker came to take it from her hand, and their eyes met for exactly a moment across the threshold. He took the report. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "What is this?" "Household accounting for the past 3 weeks," she said pleasantly. "I need your countersignature as ranch manager to complete the record. Standard practice, my last employer required it." Parker looked at the report, then at her. He knew it was something. He couldn't tell what. His eyes moved across the pages with the controlled urgency of a man looking for the trap before he steps in it. "I'll review it," he said. "Of course. I'll need it back by end of day. I'm sending the household accounts to Mr. Merritt's solicitor in Helena as part of a routine filing." She kept her voice absolutely even. "Enjoy your morning, Mr. Parker." She walked back to the house. She heard the office door close behind her, and she counted to 10, and then she let herself breathe. Pete was already on the road to the Haskell Ranch. Dill was at the south gate. Farr was in the east room, writing a letter to the widow in Cascade City. And Caleb, she found him in the barn, where he always went when he needed to be doing something with his hands. She stood at the barn door and said, "It's in motion." He looked at her from across the aisle. "Parker." "He's got the report. He'll be reading it for hours." She paused. "Pete's on the road. Dill's at the gate." He nodded. He went back to work. Then he stopped. He turned around and looked at her in the barn doorway, and he said, "You went to the office." "I stood in the doorway." "That's not what you promised." She held his gaze. "I promised I wouldn't be in a room alone with him. I was in a doorway. He came to me." She paused. "I calculated the risk. It was manageable." "Clara." His voice had that roughness again. "You don't get to calculate the risk on your own and then tell me about it after. You calculate risks on your own all the time. This is—" He stopped. "Different." She didn't say it unkindly. "Because I'm your wife, or because you think I can't assess a situation accurately. Because I can't." He stopped again, and something moved across his face that he clearly hadn't intended to let move there. He looked at the horse he was working with. He looked at his hands. "Because if something happened to you, and I wasn't there to stop it, I couldn't—" He didn't finish the sentence. The barn was very quiet. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at Caleb Merritt, who had been a man of few words and fewer admissions since the day she'd met him, and who had just come as close to saying something real as she'd seen him come. She said, "I'll tell you before I move, not after." He looked at her. "That's what I can offer," she said. "Not that I'll stop thinking for myself, but I'll tell you first." After a moment he said, "All right." She nodded and turned to go. "Clara." She stopped. "The Haskell cattle," he said. "When they come, I want you there. When we bring them in, I want you to see the count." He paused. "You built that solution. You should see it land." She stood with her back to him for a moment, and something in her chest shifted that she didn't immediately have a name for. "All right," she said. "I'll be there." The Haskell cattle arrived on the third day, driven by Rupert Haskell himself, and two of his men, 63 head, moving through the south gate in the gray of early morning. Dill was at the gate. Pete and Amos were on either side of the herd. Caleb stood at the gatepost and watched them come in, and Clara stood beside him. She counted them through the gate quietly in her head. 63. Every one. When the last one came through, Rupert Haskell rode up to the gate and shook Caleb's hand, and then he looked at Clara and said without ceremony, "You're the one who put this together." "It was Mr. Merritt's ranch to protect," she said. Rupert looked at her steadily. "That's not what Pete Dunbar says." Caleb glanced sideways at her. She kept her eyes on the herd. "Your herd's above threshold," she said. "That's what matters today." Parker found out about the cattle from Tobias Walsh at breakfast. Walsh had been in the south pasture and had seen the new animals come in, and he told Parker in the bunkhouse before anyone could stop him. Clara heard it secondhand from Pete, who heard the conversation through the bunkhouse wall, and she was at Caleb's side before Parker came out of the bunkhouse door. Parker came across the yard with his jaw set and his eyes moving between the south pasture where the new cattle were and the ranch house, and Caleb standing in front of it. "Where did those cattle come from?" he said. "The Haskell spread," Caleb said. "Purchased on a 90-day note." "You bought 60 head without consulting me." "I own the ranch, Parker. I don't consult. I decide." Parker looked at him, then at Clara beside him. Something calculated and cold moved through his expression as he put it together. The cattle above threshold. The audit delayed the solicitor in Helena that the household report had mentioned. He said very quietly, "What have you done?" "What I should have done the week I inherited this property," Caleb said. "I'm asking you to go to the bunkhouse and stay there until further notice. A territorial marshal is arriving in 3 days. He'll have questions for you." Parker went very still. The yard was not empty. Dill was by the fence. Pete and Amos were 10 feet away. Rupert Haskell and his men were at the south gate. Even Tobias Walsh, standing behind Parker, had taken one step back. Parker looked at all of them. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. "You think you've won something," Parker said. "I think I've done what I said I'd do," Caleb said. "I gave you a chance to come forward with the accounting. You didn't take it. You have no idea." Parker's voice cracked just slightly on that last word, and it was the first crack in 12 years of certainty, and everyone in the yard heard it. "No idea what it cost me to run this ranch. What your father promised me. What was owed." "Whatever was owed to you," Caleb said, "you were not owed Silver Creek Ranch. You were not owed the right to steal from a dying man. And you were not owed the chance to take from a widow in Cascade County who lost her children over it." Parker flinched. Clara watched it happen, the involuntary, uncontrollable flinch of a man who did not know that anyone knew about Cascade County, and who understood in that instant that the walls he'd believed were solid had been somehow looked through. "Go to the bunkhouse," Caleb said. Parker went. He walked across the yard with his back straight and his head up and his hands at his sides, and he went into the bunkhouse and closed the door, and the yard was quiet. Caleb stood where he was for a long moment. Then Clara said quietly beside him, "Dill, can you make sure someone's always got an eye on that door?" "Already planning on it," Dill said. She looked at Caleb. His face was not triumphant. It was something closer to exhausted and clear, the face of a man who has finally put down something very heavy and is still feeling the weight of where it had been. He turned to look at her. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she agreed. She reached into her apron pocket without thinking about it, touched the dollar coin, and then took her hand out empty. She didn't need to hold it right now. She already knew where she stood. The 3 days before the marshal arrived were the quietest and the most dangerous days Silver Creek Ranch had seen. Parker stayed in the bunkhouse. He came out for meals and went back in, and he didn't speak to anyone except Tobias Walsh, who had nowhere else to go and the sense to keep his head down. The other hands gave Parker a wide berth, not out of loyalty anymore, but out of that particular discomfort people feel when a man they've followed for years turns out to be someone different than they thought. Amos Finch ate his meals fast and went back to work without looking at the bunkhouse. Pete Dunbar talked more than usual, the way people do when they're filling silence that used to feel normal and now doesn't. Caleb ran the ranch. He was up before dawn and out late, and he did it without Parker's guidance for the first time in 2 years, and he found to his own quiet surprise that he knew more than he'd been told he knew. Dill Greer rode beside him and offered information when it was useful and kept his mouth shut when it wasn't, and between the two of them, they managed the daily operations of Silver Creek Ranch without asking Gideon Parker for a single thing. Clara watched Caleb do this and said nothing about it, but she noticed. The letter from Farr's contact reached them on the second day. The widow from Cascade County, her name was Ellen Marsh, had written back. She would testify. She had kept records. She had kept everything, every document, every letter, every piece of paper from the period when her ranch was taken from her in a trunk under the bed of the boarding house room she'd been living in for 3 years. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and pressed her hand flat on top of it and sat very still for a moment. Caleb came in and saw her face. "What is it?" She slid the letter across. He read it. He read the part where Ellen Marsh described standing in the yard of her ranch, watching strangers drive her cattle out through the gate with her 3 children behind her, the youngest one crying because he didn't understand what was happening. He read the part where she said she'd written letters to the bank, to the territorial governor's office, to anyone she could think of, and received nothing back except formal language that explained very politely why there was nothing to be done. He set the letter down. She kept everything, Clara said. 3 years in a boarding house room, and she kept every piece of paper. Because she knew someday someone would need it, Caleb said. Yes. He looked at her. This happens to other people, and nobody does anything because there's no one with enough to fight it. A widow with 3 children doesn't have a Solomon Farr. She doesn't have... He stopped. She doesn't have what we have, Clara said quietly, which is why we use what we have. For her, not just for us. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I want to write to her, directly, tonight. I think that would mean a great deal to her, Clara said. I went to the study and wrote the letter himself in his own handwriting, which was not elegant, but was honest, and he told Ellen Marsh what was happening and what Farr had found, and that her records would matter, and that she would not have to carry what she'd been carrying alone anymore. Clara sealed the envelope for him because his handwriting got worse when he was tired, but the words inside were entirely his. The marshal arrived on the morning of the third day. His name was Hector Vance, and he came with a deputy and 2 men from the territorial prosecutor's office, and he came quietly without announcement, the way a man comes when he wants the situation to be contained before anyone has a chance to complicate it. He presented his credentials to Caleb in the front yard and said, "We'll need to speak with Gideon Parker, and we have a colleague moving simultaneously on Edwin Cross this morning." He looked at Caleb directly. "Mr. Farr tells me you've been holding this together for 3 days. "With help," Caleb said. Vance looked past him at Clara, who was standing on the porch. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, "Mr. Farr's correspondence suggests a significant portion of the groundwork here was yours. Mr. Merritt's ranch." "Mr. Vance," she said, "I just helped with the books." Vance looked like a man who knew understatement when he heard it. "We'll need statements from both of you, and from Dill Greer, and from the Haskell brothers when they're available." "Dill's in the barn," Caleb said. "I'll get him." "In a moment." Vance looked at the bunkhouse. "Parker first." They brought Parker out into the yard. He came out of the bunkhouse door and saw the marshal's badge and the deputy and the 2 men from the prosecutor's office, and he stopped in the doorway for exactly 1 second. Just one, and in that second, something moved through his face that was not what Clara expected. It wasn't panic. It wasn't rage. It was something that looked almost like resignation. Like a man who has been waiting for a door to close and has finally heard it shut. Then his face went controlled and careful, and he stepped out into the yard. "Gideon Parker," Vance said, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and misappropriation of estate assets in connection with the Silver Creek Ranch and the Cascade County matter. You'll come with us to Silver Creek for processing and then to Helena." Parker said nothing. He looked at the marshal. He looked at his deputy. He looked at the 2 men from the prosecutor's office. And then he looked at Caleb Merritt, who was standing 8 feet away with Dill Greer at his shoulder, and he looked at him for a long moment in silence. Caleb looked back. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stood on the ground of Silver Creek Ranch in the morning light and held Parker's gaze, and Parker, for the first time in 12 years, looked away first. Then Parker looked at Clara. She was on the porch, both hands at her sides, and she watched him with an expression that was not triumph. It was the expression of someone who has seen something through to where it needed to go and is simply present at the end of it. Parker said to the yard in general, to no one and everyone, "I built this ranch. Whatever anyone says, I built it." No one disputed it. No one agreed with it. The deputy moved forward, and Parker went with him, and they walked across the yard toward the marshal's horses, and Tobias Walsh, standing in the bunkhouse doorway, watched his employer walk away, and then sat down heavily on the step and put his face in his hands. Amos Finch, standing by the fence, looked at the ground. Pete Dunbar stood very straight and very still. Dill Greer said nothing. He watched Parker go with the expression of a man who has set something down. He's been carrying for a very long time and is still feeling the absence of the weight. The statements took most of the day. Farr managed the process with the prosecutor's men, and Caleb and Clara gave their accounts separately in sequence, and then together when the details needed to be corroborated. Dill Greer sat across from the deputy for 2 hours and told everything he knew. The sales, the signature. He'd seen the implied threats, the silence he'd kept, and why he'd kept it in the flat, honest voice of a man who has decided that the truth is the only thing he has left to offer. When Dill came out of the room, he looked older and lighter at the same time. He found Clara in the kitchen making coffee and said, "That's the hardest 2 hours I've spent in a long while." "I know," she said. "I should have spoken sooner." "You spoke when it counted." She poured him a cup. "That's what matters." He took the coffee and held it in both hands and looked at the table. "Your husband's a better man than he knows he is," he said, not quite to her. "He's getting there," she said. Dill smiled, small, genuine something that hadn't been on his face in a long time. "So are you, Mrs. Merritt. So are you." The telegram from the prosecutor's office arrived late that afternoon. Edwin Cross had been detained at his property in the next county. He had not resisted. He had, according to the report, asked immediately for a lawyer, which Farr said was the action of a man who knew exactly what was in the ledgers and had no intention of pretending otherwise. And an hour after that, a second telegram arrived from the Banking Commission in Helena. Douglas Halverson had been suspended from First County Bank pending investigation. His correspondence files had been seized. And in those files, this was the part that made Farr set down the telegram and press his fingers to his mouth for a moment before he spoke. In those files were letters from Halverson to 3 other banks in 2 other territories, laying out a template for the performance clause scheme. A template. Written out step by step, like instructions. He had done this before. He had planned to do it again. And he had written down how. Farr read the key passage aloud at the kitchen table, and Clara listened, and Caleb listened, and when it was done, the room was quiet. "How many properties?" Caleb said. "The commission is still counting," Farr said. "At least 5 that they can trace directly, possibly as many as 11 across 3 territories." 11 families, Clara said. "Yes." She stood up and went to the window and stood there for a moment, with her back to the room. Caleb watched her. He could see the set of her shoulders, not defeated, not grieving exactly, but the posture of someone absorbing something that needs to be absorbed before anything else can happen. "Ellen Marsh," she said. "She'll be called to testify in the broader case," Farr said. "Her records combined with what we've built here are the backbone of the conspiracy charge. Without her, we have one instance. With her, we have a pattern." He paused. "The commission is also looking at recovering assets for the affected families. It won't be everything, but it won't be nothing." Clara turned from the window. "Will she get her land back?" she asked directly. Farr was honest. "The land itself was resold. That's complicated. But the financial claim against Cross and Halverson, combined with the criminal forfeiture. If they're convicted, there may be enough to rebuild something. A start at least." He looked at her. "It won't undo 3 years in a boarding house room." "No," Clara said. "It won't." She sat back down. Caleb reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand there, and she looked down at it, and she didn't move away. It was the first time he'd touched her with intention, not assistance, not practicality, just presence. Just the simple statement of one person to another that they are not alone in the room. She turned her hand over and held his. 3 weeks later, Silver Creek Ranch had a new foreman. His name was Walt Ruger, and he came from Rupert Haskell's recommendation, a quiet, capable man of 50 who had no interest in anything except running cattle well and going home at the end of the day. He shook Caleb's hand and shook Clara's hand with equal seriousness and said, "I hear the ranch has had a difficult stretch." "It has," Caleb said. "It's over now," Walt said simply, and went to look at the cattle. Amos Finch had stayed on. He'd given his statement to the marshal without being asked twice, and he'd spent the week since working harder than Pete Dunbar had ever seen him work the way men sometimes do when they're paying a debt they can't pay in words. He didn't talk about it. He just worked. Pete Dunbar had been offered a foreman's assistant position by Caleb, which he'd accepted with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure he deserved it. "You earned it," Caleb told him. "I said something ugly the first day she arrived," Pete said. "And then you helped us save the ranch," Caleb said. "People don't get to be one thing." Pete thought about that for a while. The civil judgment came down 6 weeks after the arrest. The gap between what Cross had paid for Silver Creek cattle and their market value across all transactions, totaling $130, head over 18 months, was adjudicated at $2,340. Cross was ordered to pay. His assets had been frozen at filing, and the payment came from those assets, which meant it actually came. Caleb sat with the bank draft at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Clara sat across from him. "The Haskell note," she said. First, he agreed. Then, the operating account. Then the herd. He looked up. "We can rebuild the breeding stock by spring. Full capacity by next year. You'll need to hire 2 more hands for driving season." Ruger said the same thing this morning. She smiled small. Real, the kind of smile that comes from the satisfaction of things actually going the way they were supposed to go. He watched her smile and said, "I owe you something." "You don't." "I do." He held her gaze. "When you walked into this ranch, I had a foreman stealing from me a bank ready to take everything hands who didn't respect the operation and books I'd been afraid to look at. And I thought..." He paused, and the honesty of what he was about to say required him to slow down slightly. "I thought I'd solved a practical problem by bringing you here. Someone to manage the house, keep things running. I thought that was what I needed." She waited. "I was wrong," he said. "Not about needing help, about what the help was going to look like." He set the bank draft down. "You didn't manage the house, you saved the ranch. And I didn't see it until it was already half done because I was too busy thinking of you as something I'd arranged instead of someone who'd arrived." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "The $1, she said. "I know." "That's what you paid for me. I know that too." He reached into his vest pocket and set something on the table between them. A ring. Simple gold, narrow, nothing extravagant but real and chosen, and clearly not bought in a hurry. "I went to Silver Creek yesterday, to the jeweler on Main Street." He pushed it toward her. "The first time I put a ring on your finger, it was a contract. This one's a choice, my choice." He held her eyes. "If it's yours too." Clara looked at the ring. She looked at Caleb Merritt, the man who had walked into an auction with $37 and walked out with a wife he'd paid $1 for, and hadn't known what to do with, who had sat at his father's desk in the dark, going through ledgers. He'd been afraid to read, who had faced down a man he'd trusted for 20 years and not flinched, who had written a letter to a widow he'd never met because he thought it was the right thing to do. She reached out and picked up the ring. She held it for a moment in her palm. Then she reached into her apron pocket and took out the $1 coin, the one she'd kept since the first day, the starting price, the number the room full of men had found so funny, and she set it on the table between them. "I've been carrying that since the day we met," she said. "Every time I thought about giving up on the ranch, on the books, on any of it, I'd put my hand in my pocket and feel it." She looked at it on the table. "It was never a humiliation. It was a reminder that I started from the bottom, that I was still standing, that it didn't matter what someone else thought I was worth, I knew." She looked up at him. "Put the ring on," she said, "and I'll keep the $1. Because this ranch was saved by both of them." Caleb picked up the ring. He put it on her finger, and his hands were steady, and he held her hand for a moment after just held it. The way you hold something you've been afraid of losing and have decided you're done being afraid. The night before. Ellen Marsh arrived in Silver Creek. Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, the horses, the wind, the distant sound of cattle in the south pasture, the herd that was growing back into what it was supposed to be. And she thought about a woman she'd never met, who had kept every piece of paper in a trunk under her bed for 3 years, and what it meant to carry something that long on the chance that someday someone would care. She got up before dawn and went to the kitchen and started baking. Caleb found her there at 5 in the morning with flour on her hands and 2 pies in the oven and said, "You're thinking about her." "I am." He sat down at the table. "She's going to be all right." "I know." Clara kept working. "I just want her to walk in and feel I want the first thing she feels when she arrives to be that someone was expecting her, that someone prepared." She smoothed the edge of the dough without looking up. "She's been a long time without anyone preparing for her." Caleb watched her at the table. "I thought about the day he'd walked into an auction and said $1 out loud without knowing why, and the woman who had looked at him across that room with evaluation, not gratitude, and the 37 days since then that had rearranged everything he thought he understood about what a ranch was and what it needed and what he was. "Clara," he said. She looked up. I'm glad you were there, he said. That day, at the auction. She held his gaze. I'm glad you said $1, she said, and not $2. He laughed. It was short and real and surprised her slightly because she hadn't heard him laugh before, not like that, not unguarded. It changed his face entirely. She looked at him laughing and thought, there it is. There's the man underneath. Ellen Marsh arrived at noon. She came on the Silver Creek stage, which Caleb and Clara met at the depot, and she was a thin woman with graying hair and careful eyes that moved over everything. She looked at the way the eyes of someone who has learned not to trust appearances will do. She was 41 and looked older in some ways and younger in others. She stepped off the stage, and Clara stepped forward and said, Mrs. Marsh, I'm Clara Merritt. Thank you for coming. Ellen Marsh looked at her. She looked at Caleb beside her. She looked at the wagon they'd brought and the fact that 2 people had come to meet her themselves, not sent a hand. She said, Your husband wrote to me. He did, Clara said. He said. She stopped. Her voice had held steady until then, and then it found the edge of something. She pressed her lips together for a moment. He said my records mattered, that they'd made the difference. They did, Caleb said. They're the reason Halverson can't do to anyone else what he did to you. Ellen Marsh looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked away at the street at Silver Creek, at the ordinary everyday life of a town going about its business, and she took one long breath. My youngest, she said, asks me sometimes if we'll ever have a house again. He's 9. He doesn't remember the ranch the way the older ones do, but he knows something was taken. She looked back at them. I couldn't answer him before. She was quiet for just a moment. I think I can answer him now. Clara took her arm and walked her to the wagon. The hearing in Helena lasted 4 days. Parker and Cross both testified, Parker in the clipped, careful way of a man preserving whatever he could, Cross with the visible calculation of someone negotiating terms. Halverson's lawyer made arguments that dissolved under the weight of his own written correspondence. Ellen Marsh sat in the witness stand for 3 hours and spoke with the controlled precision of a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say 10,000 times in a boarding house room and was finally in a room where it counted. Dill Greer testified about the forged signature. He was cross-examined hard by Parker's lawyer, who tried to shake his account of what he'd seen and failed because Dill Greer had spent 3 years watching what happens when you stay silent and had no intention of being uncertain about anything he knew for a fact. Rupert Haskell testified about the implied threat to his property. Solomon Farr presented the documentation in order piece by piece, building the picture, the same way Clara had first built it. Supply discrepancies, cattle records, the cross note, the loan clause, the pattern across Halverson's correspondence, until there was no remaining interpretation available that didn't lead to the same place. Caleb Merritt testified last. He sat in the witness chair and answered questions in the flat, plain voice of a man who has thought carefully about what happened and is not interested in dramatizing it. And when he was asked what the consequence of Parker's scheme would have been if no one had intervened, he said, I would have lost my father's ranch within 60 days, and I wouldn't have known why. And then he was asked, how did the investigation begin? He said, my wife noticed the numbers didn't add up on her first day on the property. The courtroom was quiet. She'd been there for 6 hours, he said. She sat down with the household ledger and she saw it. And then she told me. And then she didn't stop until we had all of it. He was not asked any further questions. Parker received 18 months in the territorial prison and 5 years probation. Edwin Cross received 2 years and was ordered to repay every dollar of the fraudulent differential plus legal costs. Douglas Halverson received 3 years, was permanently barred from banking practice in the territory, and his assets were subject to civil claims from every affected family that chose to file. 4 of the 11 families that Halverson's network had touched filed claims. Ellen Marsh was one of them. Her claim settled 8 months later at $1,400, not enough to buy back the ranch she'd lost, but enough to buy a smaller property outside Cascade City, with a house and a well and 12 acres, which she did. Her youngest, the 9-year-old who asked about houses, carried the first box inside himself. The Silver Creek town meeting that following spring was the largest anyone could remember. It wasn't about the trial. It was about a proposal Clara had written and Caleb had presented to the county commissioner, a registry of ranch operation records, independently filed quarterly with the county clerk's office, so that no property owner could be left without a record of their own operations history if their manager chose to control that information. Simple. Low cost. The kind of thing that seemed obvious once someone had said it. The commissioner approved it in 20 minutes. Rupert Haskell shook Caleb's hand afterward and said, "Your wife wrote that proposal." "She did," Caleb said. "You should tell people that." "I do," Caleb said. "Every time." Clara was across the room talking to a woman she'd met once, a rancher's wife from the North County who'd come specifically to ask her about the household accounting system she'd developed, which Farr had mentioned in the trial record, and which 2 other ranch operations had already asked to adapt. Clara was explaining it the way she explained everything directly, practically, without making it seem like more than it was. Caleb watched her from across the room. "I thought about an auction hall and sawdust and pipe smoke, and a room full of men who thought the funniest thing they'd seen all year was a woman going for $1. He thought about a wagon ride in silence, and a kitchen that was a disaster, and a ledger tucked behind a jar of molasses. He thought about the look on Dill Greer's face the morning everything finally moved, and Parker walking across the yard with his hands at his sides, and the telegram about Ellen Marsh's trunk of papers. I thought about a ring on a table and a dollar coin beside it. He crossed the room. Clara saw him coming and finished her sentence to the rancher's wife and turned to look at him. He said, "Ready to go home." She looked around the meeting hall at the county commissioner, still talking to Farr at Rupert Haskell, laughing with Pete Dunbar at Dill Greer, sitting with 2 old-timers, telling a story that had all 3 of them leaning forward, and then she looked at Caleb. "Yes," she said. They walked out together into the spring evening, and the town of Silver Creek went on around them and behind them. In the meeting hall, a proposal was being filed that would protect 100 ranchers who would never know they needed protecting, because a woman who had arrived with 1 bag and been purchased for $1 had noticed a problem and decided it was hers to fix. The dollar coin was in her pocket. It always would be. Not as a reminder of where she'd started. A's proof of how far $1 spent right could go.